She was 8 months pregnant,
I
standing
want to
in the
spend the rest
freezing
of my
rain
life with you.
outside the restaurant where her
Yes, oh
husband had
yes.
once gotten down on one knee for her, and she watched him do it again for someone else at their table with a ring he bought using their company's money. Most women would have walked up to that window and started screaming. Most women would have called him and right there on the sidewalk in the rain, 8 months pregnant, and let the grief pour out of them the way it deserved to. Olivia Bennet did none of those things. She stood there. She memorized every detail. She turned around. She hailed a cab. She overtipped the driver because her mother raised her right, even in catastrophic circumstances. And she went home. And then she sat down at her desk. Because what James Harlow never knew, in 12 years of marriage, was that his wife was not just the woman who carried his child and smiled at investor dinners. She was the woman who had written every single clause of their company's founding documents. She was the woman who had built, 8 years ago, a hidden failsafe, buried so deep in their operating agreement that he had signed it without knowing it existed. He thought he was leaving his wife. He had no idea he was walking into a trap she had built before he ever gave her a reason to. Stay with us, because what happens next, what this woman does in the next 24 hours, is going to change the way you think about what quiet strength actually looks like. This story is a reminder that the most powerful move in any room is the one nobody saw you preparing. The woman who is underestimated is not the woman who is defeated. She is the woman who is dangerous. Olivia's story is not about revenge. It is about remembering who you always were, even when someone else tried to make you forget. And if you have ever been the person in the room who did all the work while someone else took all the credit, this story is for you. Hit that like button before you go. Drop a comment telling us what you would have done in her place. We read every single one. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you are not subscribed yet, join us, because every week we bring you stories exactly like this one. Stories about people who were written off, and what happened when they refused to accept that ending. We will see you inside the story.
What would you do if you were 8 months pregnant, standing in the freezing rain outside the restaurant where your husband once got down on one knee for you and watched him do it again? For someone else, in your place, at your table. Most women would fall apart. Most women would stand there in the rain, hand over their mouth, and let the grief take them right there on the sidewalk. Olivia Bennet did not fall apart. She watched. She memorized. She turned around, hailed a cab, overtipped the driver because her mother had raised her, right even in catastrophic circumstances, and went home to the penthouse she had bought with her own financial models and her own 12 years of ruthless precision. And then she sat down at her desk, and she began to build the thing that would end him. Because what James Harlow never knew, what he never bothered to find out in 12 years of marriage and partnership, was that his wife was not just the woman who carried his child and organized his calendar and smiled beautifully at investor dinners. She was the woman who had written every clause of their company's foundational documents. She was the woman who had designed the financial architecture of their entire empire. She was the woman who had built, 8 years ago, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon while James was charming clients over lunch, a fail-safe within a fail-safe, a ghost door in their financial system, a break glass in case of emergency clause buried so deep in the operating agreement that James had never read that far. He had signed it on page 47 without knowing it existed. He was about to find out. This is not a story about a woman who was broken. This is the story of what happens when you underestimate the architect. The penthouse on the 58th floor of One Beacon Tower had floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides, and on clear mornings, you could see all the way to the Hudson. Olivia Bennet stood at the east-facing window with one hand resting on her stomach, watching the city wake up below her. 8 months pregnant, still sharp, still precise in the way she had always been. The kind of precise that had nothing to do with perfection and everything to do with paying attention. She was 34 years old. She had graduated top of her class from Wharton with a concentration in financial engineering. She had co-founded Bennett Harlow Capital at 22 with nothing but a second-hand laptop, a mountain of student debt, and a mind that could see the structural weakness in any financial system within about 90 seconds. She had also, somewhere in the middle of building an empire worth $4.2 billion, fallen completely and thoroughly in love with her co-founder. That had turned out to be the riskiest investment of her career. James Harlow came up behind her at 7:15, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder, his hands coming to rest lightly on her stomach. He was handsome in that classic American way. Square jaw, dark hair, going attractively silver at the temples, blue eyes that could charm a pension fund manager into doubling his commitment over a single lunch. He was also, she would later understand, a man who had been performing love for quite some time while practicing something else entirely. But that morning, she did not know that yet. "Still planning to buy the city?" he said. "Just admiring what we built," she said. He kissed her temple. "What we built. Don't forget that part." She smiled. The baby moved. A soft, rolling shift that she had come to think of as his morning hello. She covered James's hand with hers, pressing it gently against the movement. "He's saying good morning," she said. "Smart kid." James straightened, already reaching for his phone. "I have to get moving. Big strategy session with the Telstra fund team today, and then the board has a late review tonight. Don't wait up." She turned slightly. "Another late one? It's a critical period, Liv. The Telstra acquisition is at a delicate stage. $300 million doesn't close itself." He said it with the easy confidence of a man who had said similar things many times and had never once been questioned. Which was true. She had always trusted him. She had built her entire professional life around trusting him. "Of course," she said. "I'll be here." He kissed her, quick, almost perfunctory, grabbed his jacket, and was gone. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Olivia stood at the window for a moment longer, watching the city, feeling the particular quality of the silence he left behind. Something was wrong. She had known it for 6 weeks in the way you know things before you are ready to know them. The way your body understands the truth before your mind is willing to accept it. The late nights had multiplied. His phone had developed a new habit of landing face down on every surface. 2 weeks ago, she had lifted his suit jacket from the bedroom chair and caught a scent that was not hers. Something floral, something young and sweet, like gardenias over ambition. When she had mentioned it, he had laughed it off so smoothly that she had almost believed him. Almost. She spent the morning in the nursery, which was painted a soft sage green with white crown, molding, and a custom wooden crib. She had assembled herself because James had been too busy, and she had wanted to feel useful. She was touching up a small section of the mural on the north wall, a watercolor-style fox sitting in a field of wildflowers. When her phone rang. Margaret Collins, Maggie. Her best friend since freshman orientation at the University of Pennsylvania, now one of the sharpest family law attorneys in Connecticut. "How are you feeling?" Maggie asked. "Large," Olivia said. "And patient. And large," Maggie laughed. Then the laugh faded into something more careful. "Liv, I need to tell you something, and I want you to know I've been sitting on this for 4 days, trying to figure out how, and I've decided sitting on it is worse." Olivia set down her paintbrush. "I saw James last Thursday," Maggie said. "At Nobu, he was with a young woman. I assumed it was a client dinner. You know how he is, always working a room. But Liv, they were holding hands across the table. And the way he was looking at her. Olivia said nothing. I'm sorry, Maggie said. I really am. I might be wrong. I might have misread the whole thing, but I couldn't not tell you. No, Olivia said quietly. You were right to tell me. She thanked Maggie and hung up. She stood in the middle of the nursery for a long moment, looking at the fox on the wall. Then she walked to the home office, sat down at her desk, pulled up their shared credit card statements, and began to read. She had not checked these statements in 2 years. She had trusted him. The first line that stopped her was a charge from 3 months ago. Tiffany and Company, $3,200. Coded in the expense description as, she leaned closer, client appreciation, third quarter. She read it again, client appreciation. She had run this company for 12 years. She had bought clients excellent bottles of wine, handsome notebooks, and on one memorable occasion, a very good fountain pen. She had never once bought a client something from Tiffany's, because that was not client appreciation. That was something else. She kept reading. A weekend at the Meadowlark Inn in the Hudson Valley, $1,240, the previous October. She had been home that weekend, 7 months pregnant, eating leftover Thai food and watching a documentary about Yellowstone. She picked up the phone and called the inn. Good afternoon. This is Sandra from Bennett Harlow Capital, confirming a past reservation for James Harlow. Could you remind me, was that the King Suite or the Deluxe Double? It was the King Suite, the receptionist said pleasantly, with the fireplace, for Mr. Harlow and his wife. Olivia thanked her and ended the call. His wife. She set the phone down on the desk with extreme care, the way you set something down when you are afraid that if you are not careful, you will throw it through a window. She sat for a long time in the quiet office. Then she went back to the nursery and picked up her paintbrush. She finished the fox. She painted the wildflowers around it with steady hands. And in the back of her mind, very quietly, something that had been sleeping for 12 years began to wake up. The thing about discovering that someone you love has been lying to you is that once you start looking, you cannot stop. It is like a structural analysis. Once you find the first crack, you have to know how deep it goes, how load-bearing the wall actually was, whether the whole thing is coming down or just this one corner. Olivia Bennett had been doing structural analyses since she was 22 years old. She was very good at them. That afternoon, while James was at his strategy session, or wherever he actually was, she sat at her desk and she looked, properly looked, the way she looked at financial documents, without hope, without agenda, just information. The credit card statements told a story. 8 months ago, dinner for two at a restaurant called Aldridge on the Upper West Side, $340. She had never been to Aldridge. She noted the name. 6 months ago, a flight to Charleston, South Carolina, business class, 2 tickets. The second ticket was charged to the same card under a line item she had never noticed because she had never looked. Miscellaneous partner expenses. 4 months ago, the Tiffany's charge. 3 months ago, a weekend in the Hudson Valley. 6 weeks ago, a furniture store in Soho. A delivery address she did not recognize on Mercer Street. She ran the Mercer Street address through the city property records database. It took her 4 minutes. The apartment was a rental, a 1-bedroom in a pre-war building listed at $6,200 a month. The lease had been signed 3 months ago. The security deposit had come from a Bennett Harlow client development account. She stared at that line for a long time. He had not just been having an affair, he had been funding it with company money, their money. He had been stealing from the firm they had built together, the firm she had structured, the firm she had protected for 12 years, and he had been stealing from it to pay the rent on an apartment for the woman he was apparently planning to spend his future with. The audacity of it was almost architectural in its scope. She thought about calling him. She thought about waiting for him to come home. She thought about a great many things in that quiet hour in the home office. With the late afternoon light falling across her desk and the baby moving in slow, curious circles inside her. Instead, she called Robert Hayes. Robert was 63, a senior board member who had known both her and James since the early days of Bennett Harlow. He was the kind of man who still wore a watch his father had given him and used phrases like a gentleman's word, without irony. He was also, she knew, someone who would not lie to her. "Robert," she said, "I'm sorry to call so late. How did the board review go tonight?" There was a pause. "Board review?" Robert said. "Olivia, there's no board meeting tonight. I've been home since 4 o'clock. I'm watching the baseball game with my grandson. Is everything all right?" "Yes," she said. "Everything is fine. I must have gotten confused. Give my love to Helen." She hung up. She sat at the desk, with her hands very still in her lap. It is one thing to suspect your husband is a liar. It is another thing entirely to have it confirmed by a kind old man who has absolutely no idea he just dismantled your entire world. Robert Hayes had been watching baseball with his grandson. James had told her he was in a board meeting. Both of those things could not be true. Only one of them was. She got up slowly, the weight of the pregnancy making every movement deliberate. She went to the hallway closet. She pulled out her black wool coat. She put it on over her maternity clothes. A pair of soft gray leggings and a loose white tunic that she had been wearing because it was comfortable and she was 8 months pregnant, and comfort had become a priority. She grabbed her umbrella. She called a cab. The city was already wet when she stepped outside, the rain coming down in that particular Manhattan way, not dramatic, just relentless, sheeting against the windows of every cab and storefront, turning the streetlights into blurry halos. She gave the driver the address of Aldridge, on the Upper West Side, because it had been on the credit card statement, and something in her knew, with the cold certainty of a woman who has always been better at reading structures than people, that it was where James was. She was right. The cab stopped across the street. She got out. She stood under her umbrella in the rain, and she looked through the restaurant window. She found them immediately. James was at a corner table, a secluded, intimate table by the window, the kind of table that restaurants reserve for people who want to be seen by each other and no one else. He was leaning forward, animated, his face lit with an intensity she had not seen directed at her in over a year. Across from him, radiant in a deep burgundy dress, was a young woman, Claire Whitfield, 26 years old, James's executive assistant. A woman Olivia had met perhaps a dozen times in conference rooms and hallways, always with that particular quality of someone who is waiting for something. She had been waiting, apparently, for this. Olivia watched them. Through the rain-streaked window, she watched James refill Claire's wine glass. She watched Claire laugh at something he said. Really laugh. Head back. The kind of laugh that cannot be performed. She watched him reach across the table and cover Claire's hand with his. And then, with the horrible, slow clarity of a nightmare, she watched him begin to speak, watched his expression shift into something serious and tender, watched him reach into his jacket pocket. She knew that gesture. She had lived that gesture 9 years ago at a corner table in this exact restaurant when James Harlow had reached into his jacket pocket and produced the most important question of her life. He was doing it again. He slid out of his chair and onto one knee. The restaurant seemed to collectively pause. Heads turned. A soft ripple of attention moved through the room the way it always does when someone does something cinematic in a public place. He opened the box. Claire's hands flew to her face. She nodded. He slid the ring on her finger and rose and pulled her into a kiss, and the restaurant applauded. Warm, generous. The sound of strangers celebrating a love story they knew nothing about. Outside, Olivia stood in the rain. She did not feel the cold. She did not feel the water soaking through her coat, plastering her hair to the sides of her face. She felt, for approximately 30 seconds, absolutely nothing at all. A vast, clean blankness where her heart used to be, and then she felt everything. The grief hit her like a physical force, not sharp, but enormous, like something oceanic and cold. 12 years. 12 years of building something together, of trusting someone completely, of constructing her entire adult life around the assumption that this person was who he said he was. She had been wrong. She turned away from the window. She walked to the curb. She raised her hand for a cab. When one pulled up, she got in, gave the driver her address, and tipped him $40 on a $14 fare because her mother had raised her right, and because she was not okay. But she had very good manners, and sometimes those two things were the only things keeping a person upright. The cab moved through the wet streets, and in the silence of the back seat, with the rain running down the windows and the city lights blurring into soft gold, something in Olivia Bennet shifted. The grief was still there. It would be there for a long time, but beneath it, moving slowly upward, like something geological, was something else, something cold and clear and architectural. She was not just a wife who had been cheated on. She was the woman who had written every clause of their operating agreement. And she was beginning to remember what she had built. She went directly to the home office. She did not change her wet clothes. She did not make tea. She sat down at her desk, pushed her damp hair back from her face, and opened her laptop with the focused calm of someone who has decided that falling apart is scheduled for later. First, she called Maggie. "You were right," she said when Maggie picked up. "You were right about everything. But I need the lawyer right now, Maggie, not the friend." The shift in Maggie's voice was immediate and complete. "What happened?" Olivia told her. She recounted it the way she would present a financial analysis, structured, sequential, evidence-based. The credit card statements, the hotel in the Hudson Valley, the Mercer Street apartment funded by a company account, the fake board meeting confirmed by Robert Hayes, and finally, delivered in the same flat, factual tone as everything before it. The proposal, the restaurant, the ring, the applause. There was a silence on Maggie's end that lasted several seconds. "That absolute," Maggie began, and then stopped herself. "Okay, I'm calling my paralegal. We start filing in the morning. Divorce petition, financial injunction, full asset disclosure demand. What else do you need?" "I need you to be ready for something bigger," Olivia said. Her fingers were already moving across the keyboard. "He didn't just cheat on me. He funded the affair with company money. There's a Tiffany's charge coded as client appreciation, a weekend hotel on the corporate card, a security deposit for her apartment drawn from our client development fund. He has been embezzling from Bennett Harlow for 8 months. Another silence. "Liv," Maggie said carefully, "that changes things significantly." "Yes," Olivia agreed. "It does. If you can document it, I can document it. I built the documentation system. Then we're not just talking divorce. We're talking breach of fiduciary duty. We could potentially refer to the U.S. Attorney's Office. One step at a time, Olivia said. First, I need you to research something for me. Claire Whitfield, his assistant. Full background. Whatever you can find by morning. Already writing it down, Olivia? Maggie's voice softened, just slightly. Are you okay? Olivia considered the question with the same precision she applied to everything else. Not right now, she said, but I will be. That's what I'm working on. That you all... She hung up and pulled up a secure, encrypted portal on her second monitor. She had built this portal herself 8 years ago when she was drafting the foundational documents for Bennett Harlow Capital. James had been charming clients at a lunch that ran 3 hours longer than scheduled, and she had spent that afternoon in their tiny original office in Midtown constructing the legal and financial skeleton that would protect everything they were building. She had been thorough. She had been, as James liked to teasingly call her, paranoid. She had embedded, on page 47 of the operating agreement, well past the point where she had noticed James skimming during the signing, a provision called Article 9, Section 6, the Fiduciary Breach Protocol, a clause granting the non-offending co-founder immediate, unilateral, emergency control over all primary capital accounts in the event of documented gross financial misconduct. James had signed it without reading it. She had watched him do it. She had almost said something. She had decided not to. She had also built, accessible only from her private terminal, through an encrypted channel that existed in no documentation James had ever seen, a master access override, a ghost door in their financial system. She thought of it privately as the foundation beneath the foundation, the thing you build when you understand, at a level below conscious thought, that even the strongest walls can be breached from the inside. She had hoped she would never need it. She opened it now. The interface was simple. She had designed it that way deliberately. A clean, spare dashboard with a handful of options. She had not accessed it in 8 years. Everything was exactly as she had left it. She began pulling records. Within 40 minutes, she had assembled a preliminary file that would have made a forensic accountant weep with its clarity. James had not been subtle. He had apparently operated on the assumption that she would never look, that she was too absorbed in pregnancy and nursery preparation and the general business of being a supportive wife to ever pick up their credit card statement and read past the first page. That had been his only real strategic error. There was the bracelet, the hotel, the flights, the apartment deposit. There were 2 dinners at expensive restaurants in the past month charged to a client entertainment line that she had approved for a completely different purpose. There was a weekend in Aspen in February. He had told her it was an investor ski retreat, and she had believed him, and sent him off with a new pair of gloves and instructions to call her every night. And he had called her every night, and she had thought how lucky she was to be married to someone so considerate. The Aspen trip had cost the company $9,400. She printed the summary. 12 pages of documented theft, organized chronologically, with account numbers and transaction codes. She looked at it for a moment. Then she opened a formal communication template and began drafting the notice to the board of Bennett Harlow Capital, informing them of the activation of Article 9, Section 6, citing gross financial misconduct by co-founder and CEO James Harlow, and attaching the preliminary evidence file. She wrote it in the same tone she used for all formal board communications, measured, precise, impersonal. She was not a scorned wife writing an angry letter. She was a co-founder and chief financial architect, invoking a provision she had written to protect the company she had spent 12 years building. The distinction mattered. At 12:47 in the morning, she executed the command. Deep within the servers of 6 financial institutions, a series of encrypted orders moved silently through the system. Digital locks engaged. Access protocols rerouted. Liquidity froze. Every liquid capital account at Bennett Harlow, every corporate credit line, every outbound wire authorization, all of it now required her exclusive sign-off. She leaned back in her chair. The penthouse was very quiet. Outside, the rain was letting up, the city settling into its late-night murmur. She put one hand on her stomach. The baby stirred. A slow, contemplative movement, as if he too was taking stock of things. "We're going to be okay," she told him quietly. "I built this house. I know where every load-bearing wall is, and I know exactly which ones he never bothered to check." She made herself a cup of chamomile tea and sat at the kitchen island and waited for morning. James came home at 7:52. She heard his key in the lock, heard the familiar sounds of his arrival. Jacket over the back of a chair, shoes dropped near the door, the particular quality of a man moving through his own home with the loose confidence of someone who has no idea that anything has changed. He walked into the kitchen and found her sitting at the island in yesterday's clothes, a cup of tea in front of her, watching him. "Morning," he said, manufacturing a yawn. "That review ran late. I'm completely done." He moved toward her to kiss her. She turned her head, just slightly. His lips landed on her cheek. He frowned. "You're quiet. Everything okay?" "Just thinking," she said. "About?" She let the silence stretch for one full second. "I know, James." He was reaching for the espresso machine when she said it. He stopped. "Sorry?" "I said I know." She set her cup down with a soft click. "There was no board review last night. I called Robert Hayes. He was watching the baseball game with his grandson. You were at Aldridge." The color began, slowly, to drain from his face. "I was standing on the sidewalk across the street," she continued, her voice even and measured, the way she delivered quarterly reports. "In the rain. I watched you propose to Claire Whitfield. I watched her say yes. I watched the restaurant applaud." He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "You used the company card for the ring," she said. "I found the charge this morning. It's in the file I sent to the board." His phone began to buzz on the counter. Once, then twice, then a rapid cascade of notifications that he grabbed for with shaking hands. She watched him read, watched the color finish draining from his face, and then do something interesting. Go gray, the particular gray of a man whose professional life is collapsing in real time. Emails from the CFO, from 2 board members, a notification from their primary banking partner. "The accounts," he said. His voice had changed entirely. "It says, the accounts are frozen. The Series B wire for the biotech fund was rejected. What did you—" He looked up at her. "Olivia, what did you do?" "What our bylaws instructed me to do," she said. She turned her monitor toward him, displaying the executed commands and the board notification. "I protected the company from a compromised and dishonest CEO. Every liquid account at Bennett Harlow is frozen. Every credit line is suspended. Every outbound wire now requires my authorization." He stared at the screen. He tried his corporate login. Access denied. He grabbed his phone and tried the banking app. Declined. The reality of it hit him in stages, each one visible on his face. "You can't do this," he said. "This is my company." "You were the face," she said, standing up carefully, one hand pressed to the small of her back. "I was the foundation. The foundation is done supporting a liar and a thief. A thief." He found his voice, and it came back defensive and hot. "You're being dramatic. This is a personal matter between us. Is it?" She picked up the printed file from the counter beside her. 12 pages. She laid it on the island between them. Shall we begin with the bracelet from Tiffany's? $3,200, coded as client appreciation. Or perhaps the weekend in the Hudson Valley, charged to the firm. Or the security deposit on Miss Whitfield's Mercer Street apartment, drawn from our client development fund. She met his eyes. You have been stealing from our company for 8 months, James. That is not a personal matter. That is a federal one. He went very still. Liv? His voice dropped, softened. She recognized the shift. It was the voice he used when he needed something from someone who was resisting him, the charming voice. The voice that had worked on investors, on board members, on her for 12 years. I made a terrible mistake. I know that. I was under enormous pressure with the Telstra deal, and things with Claire just... It got out of hand. I never meant for any of this to... You proposed to her, Olivia said. In our restaurant. I was... at our table. He fell silent. With a ring you charged to our company. Another silence. He looked then at her stomach, at the visible roundness of her 8th month, the physical evidence of everything they had been supposed to be building together. His expression shifted into something that might have been genuine grief or might have been a calculation. With James, she had come to understand it was sometimes very difficult to tell. Think about our son, he said quietly. Think about what this does to our family. We can fix this. Therapy. I'll end things with Claire immediately. We can find a way through this, Liv. For him. It was, Olivia would think later, the single worst thing he could have said, because she had been holding herself with tremendous precision for the past 7 hours. She had been the chief financial architect, the board communicator, the strategic executor of a plan she had built overnight. She had been, in other words, the woman she had always been at work. But the moment he used their unborn child as a bargaining chip, she became something else. She became his son's mother, and that was a different kind of power entirely. Our son, she said, and her voice dropped to something quiet and absolute, is going to grow up watching his mother lead. He is going to see what it looks like when a person builds something real. He is not going to be used as a shield for behavior that is beneath contempt. She held his gaze. Get out of my home. Olivia, get out. You can have your lawyer contact Maggie Collins for the divorce proceedings. The board will be in touch regarding the financial investigation. And if you attempt to access any Bennett Harlow account or asset in any way before this is resolved, Maggie will file a criminal referral by 5 o'clock this afternoon. He looked at her for a long moment. The man she was looking at was not the man she had married, or perhaps he was, and she was only now seeing him clearly. She was not sure it mattered. He picked up his jacket from the chair. He walked to the door. The door closed behind him with a soft, final click. Olivia stood alone in the kitchen of the penthouse, in yesterday's clothes, 8 months pregnant, with a cup of cold chamomile tea in front of her. She was, she realized, perfectly calm. She picked up her phone and called Maggie. He's gone, she said. Start filing. The board meeting was at 11 o'clock. 8 faces on her monitor, arranged in the small rectangles of a video conference. Board members from New York, Boston, and Chicago, all of them projecting the carefully neutral expressions of people who have received alarming information and are waiting to understand how alarmed they should be. Olivia had showered. She had changed into a dark navy dress. Her hair was pulled back. She looked, she hoped, like exactly what she was, a CEO who had identified a threat to the firm and neutralized it with appropriate speed and documentation. She had done this precise kind of presentation dozens of times. She knew how to read a room. She knew how to give people the information they needed in the order they needed it. She did not mention the restaurant. She did not mention the rain, or the ring, or the applause. She mentioned none of the personal elements of the previous 24 hours. She presented the financial documentation. 12 pages, line by line. Account numbers, transaction codes, dates, amounts. The bracelet, the hotel, the flights, the apartment deposit, the Aspen trip. These transactions represent a documented pattern of misappropriation of company funds over an 8-month period, she said, totaling, in the preliminary estimate, approximately $63,000. I have invoked Article 9, Section 6 of our Foundational Operating Agreement, which provides for exactly this circumstance. The freeze on our capital accounts is a temporary protective measure while the investigation proceeds. Howard Whitmore, 67, the longest-serving board member and the one she had always found most resistant to the unconventional, leaned forward. "Olivia," he said carefully, "I've known James Harlow for 15 years. I want to be certain we're not conflating a personal dispute with Howard." She kept her voice entirely pleasant. "He charged a $3,200 bracelet to a phantom client account. The charge is on page 4, with the account number and the Tiffany's merchant code. Would you like me to walk you through it?" Howard sat back. She walked them through it. At the end of an hour, the board voted. Unanimous. She was appointed interim CEO pending the investigation. James's access to all firm systems was permanently suspended. She thanked them, closed the video call, and allowed herself, for precisely 30 seconds, to feel something that resembled relief. It was over. The company was protected. The legal process was in motion. She had moved fast and documented everything, and the board was with her. She thought, maybe the worst is done. Her phone rang. It was Derek Walsh, her CFO, a man she had hired 4 years ago, championed to the board, mentored through his first year, and trusted completely. "Olivia," he said. His voice had a quality she had never heard in it before. "I need to tell you something. I've been trying to figure out how for 2 days, and I've run out of time." She went very still. "Some of the account movements," he said, "the ones that are hardest to trace in the documentation you've assembled. I helped James structure some of them. He told me it was for a confidential acquisition, a special purpose vehicle he was setting up for the Telstra deal. I didn't—" He stopped. "I should have asked more questions. I know that. But the SEC inquiry that's opening now, and it will open, Olivia, they move fast on this kind of thing. My name is going to be on those documents. And when it does, I'm going to have to cooperate fully, with everyone." The silence that followed was the loudest she had ever heard. Her CFO, the man she had hired, the man she had recommended to the board with her own professional reputation on the line. "Derek," she said finally, "how many transactions?" He told her. She closed her eyes briefly. "I need everything you have," she said. "Every communication, every authorization, every file. Sent to Maggie Collins's office by 3 o'clock. And Derek, if you cooperate fully and proactively, that matters. Make sure your lawyer knows that." She hung up. The relief that had lasted 30 seconds was gone. She was not out of the woods. She was, she now understood, considerably deeper in them than she had realized. The wall she had built had a crack she had not seen, and cracks, in her experience, had a way of growing. She sat at the desk she was now calling her own, and she thought. She thought about what she knew and what she did not know, and what the next 72 hours were going to look like. And then her phone rang again. It was Maggie. "I found something on Claire Whitfield," Maggie said. 3 things happened in the next 36 hours. The first happened the morning after the board meeting, when Olivia was in the middle of drafting a communication to their largest institutional investor, a Boston-based pension fund that held a 12% stake in the firm. She was interrupted by a text from a colleague she trusted at a competing firm. The text contained a link. The link led to a financial gossip site called Wall Street Whisper, which had apparently been operating in some shadowy corner of the internet for several years, and which Olivia had never had occasion to think about until it published a piece about her at 7:45 in the morning. The headline read, "Bennett Harlow Capital in Crisis. Co-founder frozen out amid marital dispute. Investors concerned." The piece was 6 paragraphs long. It described the account freeze in accurate financial detail. It described the board meeting in terms that suggested an inside source. And it framed the entire situation as an emotional episode. A pregnant woman, blindsided by her husband's infidelity, freezing company assets in a moment of personal crisis. Scorned wife, the piece said, more or less explicitly. Scorned wife acting impulsively. The word hormonal appeared in the 3rd paragraph. By 8:15, 3 institutional investors had sent emails requesting emergency calls. Olivia read the piece twice. She understood immediately and precisely where it had come from. James still had allies inside the building, people who had worked for him before they worked for her, people who received his calls and answered his questions, and had apparently described the board meeting to him in enough detail that he could feed it to a website designed to make her look unhinged. She had moved fast. He had moved faster. She put her head down on her desk. Not in defeat. She was very clear about that, even in the moment. She was not defeated. She was simply allowing herself 60 seconds to feel the full weight of how alone she was in this. 8 months pregnant, her company bleeding in the press, her CFO compromised, her husband engaged to her employee, and now this. 60 seconds. She lifted her head. She drafted 3 separate response letters to the institutional investors, each one tailored to that investor's particular concerns, each one factual and measured and accompanied by the relevant pages of financial documentation. She sent them before 9 o'clock. Then she called Maggie. "Someone leaked the board meeting details to a financial gossip site," she said. "I need you to put a communication lockdown in place immediately. All board members, all senior staff. Nothing about this investigation goes outside official channels." "Already on it," Maggie said. "But Olivia, I need to tell you what I found on Claire Whitfield, because it changes things. Tell me." "Her full name is Claire Whitfield Carmody," Maggie said. "Her father is Senator Douglas Carmody, ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee." The words arranged themselves in Olivia's mind with the methodical clarity of a spreadsheet populating. "The committee," she said slowly, "that oversees venture capital regulatory compliance." "Yes." "The Telstra acquisition," Olivia said. "The one James told the board was essentially approved. The one worth $300 million. The regulatory sign-off on that deal," Maggie said, "would go through the Finance Committee's Oversight Office, which Senator Carmody effectively controls." The silence between them had a particular texture. He wasn't just having an affair, Olivia said. He was marrying his way into regulatory protection. He was using our money to cultivate a relationship that he was going to use to insulate a $300 million deal and present it to the board as his own brilliance. "That's potentially influence peddling," Maggie said. "If we can document that he used company funds to pursue a relationship with the intent of obtaining regulatory favor." "It's not just embezzlement anymore," Olivia said. "No," Maggie agreed. "It's not. That was the second catastrophic event. The third happened at 9:17 that same evening. Olivia was on a call with Maggie and two members of the legal team, reviewing the new evidence about Senator Carmody and discussing whether and when to involve the U.S. Attorney's Office. She was sitting at her desk in the home office, the city spread out behind her in the dark, making notes on a legal pad in the precise small handwriting she had used since college. She felt a tightening, distinct, rhythmic. She set her pen down. Another one, closer than it should be. She interrupted the call. "Maggie," she said, "I need to stop for a moment." "What's wrong?" "I think," Olivia said, with the particular calm of a woman who has already processed so much that her nervous system has simply run out of appropriate reactions, "that I am in labor. 3 weeks early." A beat of silence. "I'll call you a car," Maggie said immediately. "Can you bring the depositions?" Olivia asked. "We can review them in the waiting room." There was a pause. "Olivia," Maggie said, "I'm serious. We're in the middle of something important." "I will bring the depositions," Maggie said, in the careful tone of someone deciding which battles to fight. "Get your bag. I'll be there in 20 minutes." Maggie arrived in 17. 3 other people arrived within the hour. Olivia's college friend from Philadelphia, who drove 3 hours without being asked after Maggie sent a single text. Her neighbor from the floor below, who had Olivia's spare key and showed up with a bag of food and the composed energy of someone who has been through this before. And her mother, Margaret Bennett Sr., who took the last flight from Boston and arrived at the hospital at 11:45 with her coat over her pajamas and her reading glasses already on. James was not there. Olivia had not called him. She had decided, somewhere between the second and third contraction, that this was not a decision that required explanation. The baby was born at 2:41 in the morning. 8 pounds, 1 ounce, healthy, loud. Furious at the world in the way that all new people are furious, confronted suddenly with the fact of existing. Olivia held him and felt something shift in her chest that was nothing like the grief of the previous 2 days. Something entirely different. Something with weight and warmth and the particular quality of a foundation being poured. She named him William James Bennett. Bennett, not Harlow. She had decided that somewhere around the third contraction, when the pain was clarifying everything beautifully. Maggie, sitting beside her, looked at the baby and then looked at Olivia. "He's perfect," she said. "Yes," Olivia agreed. "He is." She looked at her son's face, this small, furious, complete person who had arrived 3 weeks early into a situation that was, objectively speaking, a great deal to be born into. "We're going to be fine," she told him quietly, the way she had been telling him for months, from the nursery floor and the home office chair and the back of rain-wet cabs. "I built something that will hold, and I am going to teach you how to build things that hold." William Bennett blinked at her with the skeptical expression of someone unconvinced but willing to hear more. She laughed. A real laugh. The first one in 2 days. It felt like something coming back. 3 weeks passed. Olivia ran Bennett Harlow Capital from the penthouse, with William in a bassinet, in the corner of the home office, and Maggie on the phone for approximately 4 hours a day, and a rotating cast of trusted colleagues who had apparently decided, without being asked, that she needed backup. She found this both touching and logistically useful. The firm was stabilized. The 3 institutional investors who had sent alarmed emails after the Wall Street Whisper piece had all accepted her documentation and confirmed their continued commitment. The board was steady. The SEC inquiry had opened formally, which was expected and planned for. Derek Walsh, true to his word, was cooperating fully with investigators. and his cooperation was proving invaluable. James, through his lawyer, had gone very quiet, which should have been a warning. On a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after William was born, Maggie arrived at the penthouse with a folder and the expression of someone delivering news that is complicated. "He's offering a settlement," she said. She laid the document on the desk. Olivia looked at it while William slept in the bassinet with the absolute conviction of a person who has decided that whatever the adults are doing, it does not require his attention. The terms were, on the surface, remarkable. James would relinquish his full equity stake in Bennett Harlow Capital. He would cooperate with the SEC investigation. He would accept full legal responsibility for the misappropriated funds and agree to repayment. He would give Olivia full physical and legal custody of William with no contest, requesting only supervised visitation. He was giving her everything, every single thing she wanted. "It's a good deal," Maggie said carefully. "I know," Olivia said. She read it again. "Will you take it?" Maggie asked. "I want to," Olivia said honestly. She looked at William. He was sleeping with his fist pressed against his cheek, a habit he had apparently developed in the womb and had no intention of abandoning. "I am exhausted, Maggie. I have a 3-week-old and a company under federal investigation, and I have not slept more than 4 consecutive hours since October. I want this to be over." "But," Maggie said. "But James doesn't fold," Olivia said. "James is a fighter. James has spent his entire professional life finding angles that other people missed." She turned a page. "Why is he giving me everything I want?" The answer was on page 11, 14 lines into a subsection labeled General Release and Non-Disparagement, which is the kind of section that sounds like standard boilerplate and is in standard boilerplate precisely that. This one was not standard. The non-disparagement clause, as written, was broad enough to prevent Olivia from voluntarily cooperating with any government agency investigating any matter related to the formation, operation, or regulatory history of Bennett Harlow Capital. In plain language, if she signed this settlement, she could not talk to the SEC. She could not talk to the U.S. Attorney's Office. She could not cooperate with the investigation into James's alleged attempt to use his relationship with Senator Carmody's daughter to obtain regulatory protection for the Telstra deal. He was not surrendering. He was buying her silence. He had wrapped the trap in everything she wanted and delivered it with a bow. Olivia set the document down on the desk. She felt something that was not quite anger and not quite admiration. Something in between, the feeling you get when an opponent makes a move that is genuinely impressive, even as it is directed at destroying you. "He knew," she said. "The federal investigation is moving faster than his lawyers told him. He needed me quiet. And he almost—" "Maggie, I almost—" "You didn't," Maggie said. "I almost did." She sat back. William stirred in the bassinet, made a small sound, settled again. "Counteroffer. Same terms across the board. The equity, the custody, the repayment, everything. But the non-disparagement clause comes out entirely, and I want his full written cooperation with both the SEC and the U.S. Attorney's Office, with immunity waived, or I walk into the federal building tomorrow morning and hand them everything we have." Maggie looked at her for a moment. "He's not going to like that," she said. "No," Olivia agreed. "He's not." She picked up the settlement and turned to the signature page, where her name waited in a blank line at the bottom. She did not sign it. She handed it back to Maggie. "Send the counteroffer by end of day," she said. "And Maggie, thank you for seeing what I almost didn't." Maggie tucked the folder under her arm. "You would have seen it." "I almost didn't," Olivia said again. Almost, Maggie said, is the whole story, Liv. Almost only counts in horseshoes. Olivia looked at her. My grandmother used to say that, Maggie said. I never understood it until right now. James took the counteroffer. He had no real choice, and his legal team, whom Maggie described as expensive and increasingly exhausted, apparently told him so clearly. The federal investigation, once Maggie formally forwarded the documentation about Senator Carmody and the Telstra regulatory strategy to the U.S. Attorney's Office, expanded significantly. What had begun as a relatively contained embezzlement case grew into something considerably more serious. An examination of whether company funds had been used to cultivate a relationship with the explicit purpose of obtaining regulatory favor. Potential influence peddling, potential fraud on the firm's investors. James cooperated. He cooperated because Maggie had made the alternative clear, and because his lawyer had made the mathematics clear, and because James Harlow had, at the end of it, always been better at charm than at genuine strategic thinking. He had believed, right up until the moment the counteroffer landed on his desk, that there was still an angle he could find, that there was still a way to charm his way to a better outcome. There wasn't. He pleaded guilty to 1 count of misappropriation of corporate funds and 1 count of fraudulent misrepresentation to company investors. 18 months in a minimum security facility, full restitution, full forfeiture of his equity stake in Bennett Harlow Capital, which reverted to the company under the exact provision that Olivia had written on page 47 of the operating agreement 8 years ago. Senator Carmody's office released a statement the same day, expressing shock and disappointment at the allegations, and emphasizing, at considerable length, that the senator had been entirely unaware of any improper intent on Mr. Harlow's part. The Telstra Regulatory Review was reassigned to a different committee subgroup. The Telstra deal, as it turned out, survived. It required a new approval process, 3 additional months, and a great deal of patient correspondence from Olivia's office. But it survived. She chose to close it herself, not because she needed to prove something, because it was the right outcome for their portfolio companies. And they had not done anything wrong, and she saw no reason they should pay for James's choices. That was the difference between her and him, she thought. He had always been willing to let other people pay for his choices. Claire Whitfield Carmody had apparently left the country. One of Olivia's contacts mentioned, in passing, that she had taken a position at a law firm in London. Olivia filed this information in the part of her mind reserved for things that had been resolved and did not require further attention. Derek Walsh received a reduced sentence, probation, and a substantial fine in recognition of his early and complete cooperation. He had not been malicious. He had been incurious at a moment when curiosity would have saved everyone a great deal of trouble. She did not rehire him, but she gave him a fair reference, because the reference was accurate, and accuracy had always been her standard. On the day the plea agreement was finalized, Maggie texted her a single line. It's done. He takes everything. You're free. Olivia read the message in her home office with William asleep in the bassinet and the afternoon light coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 58th floor. She sat with it for a moment. She had imagined this moment many times in the preceding weeks. The moment when it was officially over. She had imagined it might feel like an explosion, or like a release, or like the particular triumph of watching something you had worked toward finally arrive. It felt like none of those things. It felt quiet, heavy in a way that was not quite sadness and not quite relief. It felt like standing in a room after all the furniture has been moved out, looking at the walls and the floor and seeing, for the first time, the actual dimensions of the space. A life had been broken. His, yes. but also the version of her life she had been building. The version with the shared penthouse and the joint name on the door and the assumption of a particular future. That version was gone. In its place was something else, something that was only hers. She picked up William, who woke up with the cheerful indignation of someone who had decided naps were for other people. "It's over," she told him. He regarded her with the serious blue eyes that were, she noted, not James's blue and not her own brown, but something new. His own color, his own thing, arrived entirely on his own terms. She kissed his forehead. "Now we build something better," she said. 6 months later, the name on the door changed. It had always said Bennett Harlow Capital in steel letters above the elevator bank on the 42nd floor of a midtown building. The day the equity transfer was finalized and James's name was legally removed from the partnership, Olivia authorized a facilities request that she had been quietly looking forward to for approximately 3 months. The hyphen came down. The Harlow came down. What remained said Bennett Capital Group. Her name only, on every door, every letterhead, every wire transfer authorization, every email signature, every business card in the supply closet. She stood in the lobby that morning and looked at it for a long moment. Then she went upstairs and got to work, because she had a 9 o'clock call with a biotech fund in Seattle, and sentiment, however earned, did not close deals. The firm was smaller than it had been before. 2 institutional investors had quietly withdrawn during the crisis period, not in hostility, but in the particular way of large institutions that prefer not to be adjacent to headlines. She understood this. She did not hold it against them. But the investors who had stayed through the investigation were, she had come to understand, better investors for it. They had seen her under pressure. They had seen her move fast, document clearly, protect the firm's assets, and emerge from an extraordinary situation with the company's integrity intact. They had stayed because they trusted her judgment, not the firm's reputation, her judgment. 3 new investors had come in since December. All 3 had reached out to her directly, not through a placement agent or an intermediary, directly. 2 of them cited the Wall Street Whisper article specifically, the one that had called her a scorned wife acting impulsively, and said they had found it, on reflection, a useful indicator of exactly the kind of operator they wanted to work with. Someone who moved decisively under pressure. Someone who didn't flinch. She found this, privately, very satisfying. William was 6 months old and had developed strong opinions about most things. He had opinions about his morning schedule, about the specific angle at which he liked to be held, and about the view from the 42nd floor windows, which he examined with the evaluative expression of a person considering an investment. On the morning that Maggie called to tell her the Wall Street Journal wanted to do a profile, Woman Rebuilds venture capital firm after co-founder's fraud, they were calling her a rare combination of financial genius and emotional fortitude. Olivia was standing at the east-facing window of her office with William on her hip, looking at the city. "What do you want me to tell them?" Maggie asked. "Tell them I'm busy," Olivia said. "Tell them to check back in a year. We'll have better numbers by then. They'll run the story anyway," Maggie said. "Someone on the board will give them a quote." "I know," Olivia said. "Let them." She was not interested in being profiled. She was not interested in being a story. She had spent 2 years being a story. The brilliant co-founder, the pregnant wife, the scorned woman, the ruthless architect. She was finished with being whatever shape other people needed her to fill. She was interested in building something that would last. William reached up and grabbed a fistful of her hair with the single-minded focus he applied to all physical investigations, and she gently extracted his hand and kissed his knuckles, and he looked at her with those new blue eyes that were entirely his own. "You ready?" she asked him. He was, she felt, willing to be convinced. That evening she stood in the nursery. The room was exactly as she had painted it. Sage green walls, white crown molding, the wooden crib she had assembled herself on a night that now felt like it belonged to a different person. The fox was still on the north wall, surrounded by watercolor wildflowers. She had touched it up twice since William arrived, adding a small second fox in the lower right corner, smaller, still figuring out the field. She sat in the nursing chair in the corner, with William drowsing against her shoulder, and she thought about everything that had happened in the past 8 months with the particular quality of attention she brought to things that mattered. She thought about James, not with hatred. She was surprised to find she had arrived at something that was not quite pity and not quite forgiveness, but perhaps something adjacent to both, a kind of clinical understanding. He had been a man who had believed his own story. He had believed he was the architect. He had believed for 12 years that the empire existed because of his vision and his charm and his ability to walk into a room and make everyone in it want to give him money. He had forgotten, or perhaps never truly known, that vision without structure is just a dream, and charm without foundation is just weather. She had been the structure. She had been the foundation. And when the moment came, she had known exactly where the load-bearing walls were. She thought about what the past 8 months had taught her. And she thought about it the way she thought about everything worth understanding. Not as a personal story, but as something transferable, something with application beyond her own situation. There were things she now knew with a certainty she would not have had before. The first was this: documentation is not paranoia. It is the infrastructure of self-protection. She had built fail-safes and protocols and backup systems because she had an engineering mind and a deep-seated belief that even the strongest walls can fail. James had called her paranoid. The word had stung, mildly, for years. She was done being stung by it. The woman who documents is the woman who survives. The second was this: the moment you start making excuses for someone's secrecy, you have already begun to lose yourself. She had felt the wrongness for 6 weeks before Maggie's phone call. She had named it hormones, pregnancy brain, the particular anxiety of first-time motherhood. She had been explaining away her own intelligence in service of a man who was not worth the explanation. Pay attention to what you know. Your nervous system is smarter than your optimism. The third was this: there will be moments in the middle of building something real when someone will try to hand you a gift that is actually a cage. Read everything. Read page 47. Read the fine print. The most dangerous traps are the ones dressed as the things you want most. And the fourth, the one she held the longest, there in the nursing chair with her son, breathing slowly against her shoulder, was this: strength is not the absence of grief. She had grieved. She had sat on the nursery floor and cried with her back against a half-assembled crib. She had stood in the rain outside a restaurant and felt herself disappear. She had put her head down on her desk in a moment when the walls were closing in from every direction. She had felt all of it. And then she had lifted her head. Because grief is not the end of the story. It is the moment before the story changes. The city glittered outside the nursery window. 8 million people, all of them building something. William shifted against her shoulder. She pressed her lips to the top of his head. She thought about the name on the door of the 42nd floor. Bennett Capital Group. Her name, one name, No hyphen, no compromise, no accommodation for someone else's legacy at the expense of her own. She had not set out to build an empire by herself. She had set out to build something with someone she loved, and that person had turned out to be a different person than she thought. And the empire had turned out to be something she had built mostly alone all along. The difference now was that she knew it. The difference now was that the name on the door said so. William was fully asleep. She could feel his weight settle into the deep, unhurried heaviness of a sleeping baby. The full trust of a person who has decided that the arms holding him are safe. She was not going to be perfect at this. She was going to make mistakes, as she made mistakes in everything she did, calculated, examined, corrected. She was going to have days that were harder than she expected, and weeks that tested the foundation she had spent the past 6 months rebuilding. But she was also going to have this room, this child, this life that belonged entirely to her, this company with her name on the door, built on financial architecture that she understood better than anyone and would continue to understand better every year. She was the architect. She had always been the architect. And architects do not mourn the buildings that were torn down. They look at the cleared ground. They pick up their tools, and they build. Olivia Bennett did not get a happy ending. She got something better. She got a true beginning, a company that bore only her name, a son who would grow up watching his mother lead. The knowledge, unshakable, foundational, that she had built the cage, held the key, and when the moment came, had known exactly what door to open. James had thought she was just the wife. He forgot she was the architect, and an architect always keeps the blueprints. If Olivia's story moved you, if any part of it felt familiar, if you have ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, leave a comment below. Tell us what you would have done in her place. Hit that like button if this story stayed with you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to this channel, because we tell stories like this every week. Stories about people who were counted out and what happened when they counted themselves back in. We will see you in the next one. And the content you are about to hear has been carefully researched, written, and manually edited by our team, crafted with intention, built with care, to bring you not just a story, but a lesson worth carrying with you.